the grassy knoll's got a gun. He's gonna shoot the president. Holy smokes, I've gotta do something. All right, Lee, time to become an American hero.
Darkmyths.org and Neopolis Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
The two representatives refused to talk to me in the presence of the Dallas police at the Dallas City Hall last Saturday night. I have been requested to return to New Orleans for questioning. I have refused simply because I have a job and family here to consider. At no time I have refused to be interviewed by proper authorities, and at no time in the future I will be. I know nothing pertinent that I could tell the New Orleans people, but any time they wish to question me under the reasonable condition mentioned before, I am available.
From Garrison inviting you to be on his team?
No, I received news from a mutual friend and say that Mr. Garrison was wanting to talk to me. And first I want to thank everybody who have been calling my house, offering me all type of help yesterday and today. I may be needing all that help because I intend to fight until the end this extradition, until everybody will know what Garrison really is, the biggest fraud of this year.
And that, folks, was the voice of Sergio Arcacha Smith. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is episode 120 of the Lone Gunman Podcast. I am Rob Clark, and I got a great show for you today. Before we get started, though, I want to touch on something real quick. A few things, actually. My friends, my family over at the Dark Myths Collective of podcasts feature a podcast every month for you to check out. And I'm here to tell you about it. And this month, for June, we're focusing on a podcast called Blurry Photos. You can find all their stuff at blurryphotos.org. And the hosts are Dave Flora and Dave Stecco, two Daves. So they basically go by Flora and Stecco. But, you know, they talk about stuff from history, mythology, conspiracy, the paranormal. They do keep a sense of humor about it, but they do lots of research. And, they joke the whole way. Each episode starts off with an original humorous sketch, and then they actually get into the show. They've been doing it for 4 years. Their entire back catalog is free to listen to at their website. That's blurryphotos.org. Some highlighted episodes are 135, The Wendigo, 137, The Flat Earth Theory, or episode 124, Rainmaking. Okay? So make sure you check it out. It's a funny, entertaining podcast, and I highly, highly recommend it. Okay, today, folks, before we get started here and really get into what we're doing, it is, of course, time for
Ridiculousness of the Week.
That's right, people. Ridiculousness of the Week. Now, I don't know how many of you out there are familiar with something that's been taking the internet by storm lately, called the Mandela effect. Okay, but basically the idea of it is this, that some people believe that they are experiencing and noticing certain effects of a parallel timeline, like a parallel universe type deal, you know. The reason it's called the Mandela effect is that some people remember Nelson Mandela dying in jail, when in fact he did not. He lived to a very old age, at least according to the timeline that we're on now. He died in 2013. I distinctly remember President Obama going to his funeral and several other world leaders. But some people don't remember that. Some people believe that he died in jail many years ago. You know, weird stuff like this. Like some people remember Kirk Douglas dying some time ago, and I thought I did too. I thought I remembered seeing pictures like in the Inquirer of Michael Douglas, you know, wearing sunglasses at his father's funeral. But in fact, that didn't happen either. At least not in this timeline. Some other odd things are just the way the people remember brand names, like Captain Crunch being spelled out Captain instead of Cap'n, you know, C-A-P-N. Bragg's apple cider vinegar is organic. Some people remember it being called Bragg's, B-R-A-G-G''S. But in fact, it never was in this timeline. It always was just Bragg. Bragg. Organic raw apple cider vinegar. Some others are the way the Chick-fil-A is spelled. It's actually spelled out CHICK-FIL-A in this timeline. Some people remember it being CHIC or CHIK only. Yeah, I always thought it was CHIK, but you know, just weird little things like this, you know, little glitches in the matrix. And a friend of mine sent me one, of course, while we're talking about this, for the JFK assassination, you know, with the question mark, the Mandela effect. So, of course, this intrigued me a little bit. One other one that's very popular on the internet before we get into this is the Berenstain Bears. Now, when I was growing up, I could have swore that it was the Berenstain Bears, spelled Berenstein. Okay, the Berenstain Bears. Apparently it never was that. According to this timeline, it has always been the Berenstain Bears. Berenstein, like stain, like you stain, you know, you have a ketchup stain on your shirt. Stain. That doesn't even sound right to me. The Berenstain Bears? I don't know. I always thought it was Berenstein. But that's the Mandela effect in a nutshell. So I watched the video, and I'll post it up over on tlgpodcast.com for you to watch as well, and you can check it out. You know, I clicked on it. It's got a picture of LBJ being sworn in as the cover photo, you know, on Air Force One with Jackie standing there, and of course Albert Thomas in the background giving the old wink. And the gist of the video didn't really have much to do with a Mandela effect, though. Although the person that made this video seems to think that it does. Now, I'm not sitting here and saying, you know, that the Mandela effect is something real and that there's a glitch in the matrix and, you know, we're seeing cracks, you know, fetter through. It is odd, though. It's an odd phenomenon, you know. Just, I think it has more to do with the way your brain associates things and remembers things. You know, more along that kind of line. But this video seems to think that Jackie Kennedy was behind JFK's assassination and that she was a Jesuit assassin. Yeah, a Jesuit assassin. and that she pulled his head down and shot him real quick, then shoved the gun in behind him. And now that this is the way this guy believes that the assassination went down, and that the Zapruder film has been changed from the way everybody remembers it. It's a very odd thing, but likely to me to be much more
Ridiculousness of the week.
Yeah. So everybody out there, if you have any good examples of the Mandela effect that I haven't mentioned, I know there's some good videos out there on the internet. I'll post a few of those over on tlgpodcast.com as well for you to check out if you're interested in learning more about the Mandela effect and seeing if you remember things differently than the way they are now. I think it's a good, could spark a good conversation with your friends if you want to, talk about some cool stuff. But yeah, check it out. And without further ado, I bring to you my friend and author of Two Princes and a King, which you can get on Amazon right now, and I highly suggest that you do, Mr. Carmine Savastano. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. This is episode 120 of the Lone Gunman Podcast. This is your host, Rob Clark, and back on the show, my friend, the proprietor of the Neapolis Media Group and author of Two Princes and a King, and my friend, Carmine Savastano, comes back on the show. What's up, man?
Not much. How you doing, Rob?
I'm doing pretty good, considering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Life has been seemingly rough for a lot of people we know these few weeks.
Yeah, we've had a few weeks, haven't we?
Uh-huh.
But it's all good. It's all good.
Keep on pushing. That's all we can do.
Ever forward, my friend. Ever forward.
Mm-hmm.
So today, I wanted to have you on to talk about the Garrison investigation and the subversion and infiltration being attempted, to kind of sidetrack what he was doing. And before we actually started recording, you made a really good point that I'd like to reiterate, that we're going to talk about a lot of stuff here today, and we're going to have a lot of documents for you to check out, people, over at tlgpodcast.com. And Carmine made the very astute point that it would have been a hell of a lot easier to have somebody from the CIA sit Jim Garrison down and say, look, we understand what you're trying to do, but you might be unknowingly, uncovering things that we don't want the public to know that we're doing. So you need to kind of chill a little bit because, we're doing this, we're doing that, and you're going to mess it all up. Even if they weren't involved. I mean, if they were involved, of course, then there's a little bit of a problem there. But even if we say, okay, the CIA wasn't involved at all in the Kennedy assassination, but what Garrison was doing could have possibly compromised what they were doing in other places and other things, in the course of his investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And of course, everything's tied with Cuba and Castro and, these assassination attempts. And of course, New Orleans was rife with, Cuban exiles and, intelligence people and, mafia, everything else. And of course, this is Oswald's hometown. So, it was a hotbed of craziness going on down there. And, the CIA had people down there for sure. The FBI had a big presence in New Orleans as well. And Carmine, you were nice enough to dig up some good documents for us to go over here. So let's jump right into it with our document numero uno.
Okay, well, this one is a file on James Garrison that the agency, this is before Garrison has made any public announcement that he's going to be actually doing a trial. He might not have even had his suspect chosen at this point, but he was definitely investigating different sources, and he was trying to come up with how he would structure an investigation. So I believe the earliest that I've read, Garrison began in late '66. So this is probably after he's gotten some bones structure down, and he's starting to interview people. He's starting to come up with the investigation has just began, but already the agency was getting wind of it in February of '67.
Oh yeah.
So the agency's basically is seeking to block and hamper Garrison's efforts, and that could have been anticipated. I'm sure it's not out of the realm of possibility, as some officials tried to say. And presumably, they were simultaneously running hundreds of various projects and operations internationally.
Yeah.
So sensitive operations were compartmentalized, and only a small group of agency personnel were aware. Even in some cases, we know that directors of intelligence like McCone and William Colby were ignorant until after they left the agency, and the congressional investigation later revealed the operation.
Right.
So there are people in the agency that had a stake in seeing Garrison's investigation fail, whether or not, as you said, the agency was involved. So, and I don't think it's any seemingly direct connection to the assassination that forced their hand. I think that, they sought to conceal their informants, both legal and illegal, their operations, both legal and illegal.
Yep.
And, Garrison's investigation put everything at risk of discovery. The Castro plots that Allen Dulles had concealed from the Warren Commission is one of those things. If Garrison could have got somebody that was involved in that and they would have spilled the Castro plots, it would have revealed that Dulles had lied to the rest of the Warren Commission and just totally blown up the entire JFK investigation.
Yeah, well, as we'll find out later, they were running some propaganda operations in New Orleans, at the time, as far as, anti-communists and anti-Castro, and with stuff with the Cubans, and we'll get into all that, but yeah, I mean they were doing stuff down there, and to have all this exposed would have been probably not a good thing, because they're not supposed to be doing this shit over here in the United States.
Exactly. This was never supposed to be operating domestically. They're supposed to be operating internationally.
Yeah.
So these plots that you already brought up some of the elements that were in New Orleans, in Miami, in a lot of the major city areas. The plots included mafia and Cuban exile groups. You got over a dozen agency informants and sources were compromised by the attention and Garrison's legal maneuvers. So they were also covertly funding large anti-Castro exile groups in efforts to depose Cuba's dictator. So. A member, and that brings us to our first document. A member of one of those groups that's fairly well known by people, whose brother participated in the failed Bay of Pigs, informed the agency about Garrison's case, and that was Carlos Bringuier.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Bringuier, who prior had a public dispute with Lee Harvey Oswald and served in the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, the DRE.
Right.
And that's one of many Cuban exile organizations the agency was funding. So Bringuier called the CIA, and they met with the Domestic Contact Service employee Hunter C. Leek. And Leek and Bringuier in February of '67 got together, and he told Leek that the communist propaganda is being widely circulated throughout Latin America to the effect that Lee Harvey Oswald was only a pawn in a plot by the U.S. far-rightist elements to assassinate President Kennedy.
Yeah, I mean, that's says a lot right there. Because a lot of people don't really believe that their little skirmish on the street was not a planned event. It seems more like an attention getting thing.
Yeah. No one was seriously injured. Usually at those sorts of things, there were fists thrown. Someone got hurt. Especially back in the 60s, where people were a lot more loose with physical confrontations. And
then he's going to go on the radio with this guy and try to have a conversation. It's very odd behavior,
Yeah. Yeah, no, it does have the possible, seeming of something that was set up nicely just to get attention on the whole thing.
Yeah, and it worked.
Yeah, exactly. So Bringuier was basically getting the agency's attention by saying that there was a lot of propaganda being pushed, presumably by the communists or those opposed to the CIA, that far rightists were plotting, and that basically the officials were trying to cover it up. So he told the agency the U.S. is losing the propaganda war, which is causing serious and growing damage to the image of U.S. President Johnson, the CIA, the Pentagon, and the FBI throughout Latin America. He informed the agency that the New Orleans District Attorney, Jim Garrison, is conducting his own investigation of Oswald's role in President Kennedy's assassination. He also relayed that he was interviewed by 2 men from Garrison's office. Agency employee Lloyd Ray states, "We believe that there is some truth in the allegation of Garrison's investigation, and that is a matter is under a discreet and sensitive investigation by the FBI." So it's not just the agency. It's the agency, it's the FBI, it's the Department of Justice. There's a lot of officials that are trying to blunt anything going on with Garrison's investigation.
Oh yeah, because I mean, he wasn't just trying to be infiltrated by one person. There was a lot of folks representing a lot of different
interests.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good way to put it. And we're going to talk about them today, so we'll get there, people. Trust me.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, we have various types of people. You've got officials trying to get in on it. You've got the witnesses that Garrison's actually interviewed that some of them have their own interests. You have independent people who are just either trying to make Garrison look bad to get themselves fame, or they're trying to make him look good to get themselves fame. And people who might have even been there attempting to help him, but just were making ridiculous claims that couldn't be proven, so they hurt his credibility rather than help him. For instance, people like Jack Martin. People like Novell, Gordon Novell. There's a lot of people that were hurting his investigation for whatever reason, whether they were incompetent or whether it was intentional. So, yeah. So I think that we might go on to the next one. You want to hit the next document?
Sure.
This
is a good one.
Yeah. So after Garrison's investigation gained notice, with his continuing legal actions and statements in the public, the agency was prepared to fend off any blame that Garrison sought to place upon them, even rightful blame. So they attempted to defend the existing but unknown links to the agency that were possessed by some of Garrison's investigation. So the Justice Department, the executive branch, and the CIA officials were closely observing and manipulating Garrison's case illegally, by the way. People need to remember that, too. Garrison was the rightfully elected district attorney of New Orleans. That was his jurisdiction. That's the whole thing about our country and having, states' rights versus federal rights versus local rights.
Right.
The local government is supposed to be allowed to perform without hindrance by those above it, and it wasn't. So that's the big problem. Whether or not you agree with what Jim Garrison was doing, or whether or not you agree with that there was a conspiracy, we can prove for sure, based on the evidence, that justice was obstructed in New Orleans.
Yeah, he had every right to do what he was doing, wrong or not, right or wrong, agree or disagree. He had every right to do it, and they were interfering, and they
obstructed justice.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's something, too, I think that people might not understand, but they should, on both sides of the argument, because it's important. Because if we're going... That gets in the way of democracy itself. That man was elected. That man chose to do that. As long as he didn't break the law, he should have been allowed to continue his investigation unmolested by greater authorities.
Yeah, I mean, it's another thing if you want to get into whether his practices of getting witnesses were ethical or not. I mean, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Yeah, exactly.
But
he had the right at least to try to conduct an investigation.
Exactly.
So we have everybody interfering. So March, only a scant month later of 1967, the New Orleans field office of the agency reported to the Domestic Contact Service that its counterintelligence staff was keeping score for the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, who at the time would have been Richard Helms, on the gruesome proceedings in New Orleans.
There's gruesome proceedings.
Yes. The CI staff is also running name traces which appear in connection with the current investigation of the alleged conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. We regret to have to burden you with this sort of coverage, but have deferred to request after a lively discussion regarding the merit, time, and effort expended on what appears to be a sensational hoax, but understandably could be damaging to the agency if some link could be exploded by enterprising news hounds. You may recall that Lee Oswald was allegedly linked with the CIA in some early newspaper stories.
Yeah, I mean, that's some flowery language from James, was it Murphy?
Lloyd. That's from Lloyd Ray.
Oh. Yeah, and also on this document, these DCS traces that were conducted on these individuals came back with negative results, and they're talking about people like Leighton Martins, Carlos Quiroga, Sergio Carter Smith, Perry Russo. They were even checking out Dean Andrews Jr. But one name that did come back with positive results with ties to the CIA was David W. Ferry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Ferry definitely had time. Well, because they knew with Ferry and Bannister, despite what the agency might have wanted people to believe, there were connections directly to the agency. Ferry's via the Cuban exiles like Sergio Arcacha Smith that he associated with. Same with Bannister. Bannister helped Smith set up a Cuban student group. And Bannister actually did background checks for him. And Bannister, as you know from the file that it was on a prior show of yours that we discussed it, I found that file that shows that Bannister was also an informant to the CIA for a little while. So yeah, there were direct links, and they lied about all of them. And as you said earlier from our conversation that we had before the show, they should have just gone to Garrison. They really should have. The agency could have saved themselves a ton of problems if they just would have sat him down and said, listen, you are on to some agency plots. It's just not the plot you think it is. But instead, they tried to muscle him, and we see what happens.
Yeah.
All this stuff, they had to waste all this money and all this time and all this effort, and ultimately they failed. Because it does come out in the wash. Eventually, the files get released, and you get exposed.
Yeah, and it's not like Jim Garrison would have not been understanding. I mean, we're talking about a former military man, former FBI agent, Jim Garrison, would have understood that certain things of a sensitive nature don't need to be exploited for the greater good. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
he probably
definitely
would have been reasonable about it if they would have just said, hey, look, you're treading on thin ice here. You're getting into some very sensitive areas, and we understand what you're doing, but it's not what you think it is, and you're going to be compromising, some very sensitive operations if you continue what you're doing, and we'd appreciate it if you didn't.
Yeah. What kills me too is that later on, as we'll see in some of the later documents, they wasted time on people like Novell, but they never met with Garrison. I mean, it has to be vanity, I guess.
I don't know.
They just thought that they could muscle him, and he'd have to, maybe at the time they're at the height of their powers, so they thought that whatever they wanted was going to happen no matter what.
It had to be.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. They should have just sat down and quietly, like, please don't destroy all of our operations.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, he's former military, he's former FBI.
Yeah. He would have been receptive. I think you're right, but no. Instead,
yeah, they took the hard way.
Yeah, they decided the hard road.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then that just and Garrison was savvy with the press, so he knew how to get the story out.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't really. I mean, they had some people in the press, I'm sure, but not locally. They weren't going to be able to stop New Orleans. And once people picked it up in other cities, which happened, and then you had Americans even sending them money, so it showed you that a lot of the public was behind it.
Oh,
so
yeah.
They're fighting a losing battle. You can't get the genie back in the bottle once it's out.
Nope, especially once it hits national. He's on Johnny Carson, he's on NBC.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. He's on NBC telling the American people that the CIA is involved in the Kennedy assassination, pretty much. Well,
yeah.
not pretty much, exactly. I mean, it happened. So, things couldn't have possibly gone worse for them.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, because he's laying the blame squarely at the feet of the Central Intelligence Agency, right or wrong. It's very damaging.
Oh yeah, and then they're lucky at the time that none of these files came out, or that nobody came across this stuff, because if that would have happened, he might have actually got a conviction, right or wrong, on Shaw, if he would have actually been able to demonstrate that some of the evidence backed up portions of what he was saying.
Yeah, especially if he would have had that document that proves that Clay Shaw was a CIA contact agent too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was. Yeah, Shaw was used as a business contact. So, and once again, it's such a little thing. They should have just told him. Been like, yes, he was connected with us. Here's why. It has nothing to do.
Yeah, he's a very wealthy businessman that travels a lot to foreign countries, sees certain things, and just reporting back,
And some people, who are really committed to the wanting to believe that Shaw and Ferry and Oswald were some sort of plot, you have to understand that if the agency, they'd say, well, he never would have told Garrison. Well, no, if the agency, let's say they're right, that those guys were a lot more important than they seem to be based on the evidence, then effectively the agency could have just lied and give Garrison false information, and he might have bought it. So, it's not in their interest to go so far. You're only going to fabricate something if it's in your interest to do so.
Yeah, and with Clay Shaw and Ferry, it's hard to put them in a plot. We got some witnesses that put them together, put them with Oswald, and how reliable is this stuff? We don't know. And just like last week, I talked to Robert Taylor of the Minutemen, who actually claims that he saw Clay Shaw and David Ferry at a Minuteman meeting in Missouri in early '63, and that David Ferry had flown in there and had a bomber jacket on, and Clay Shaw was dressed really nice, looked really dapper, and that he didn't talk to him, but he definitely saw him. They made an impression on him, and of course, as time progressed, at the time he didn't think anything of it, because he didn't know who the hell they were and whatever. But after the Garrison investigation, and he was like, oh my God, that's the guy I saw, and
And that seems to me a hell of a lot more probable than a lot of the stories we hear, just because it was just a brush encounter, which is likely what happened with most of these people who try to make something more of it.
Yeah.
And Oswald wasn't with them. That also lends the credibility of truth, because everybody always tries to shove Oswald in the story too somehow.
Yeah.
Oswald has to make an appearance of some sort.
Yeah. I mean, I just find it interesting because, what the hell are they doing at a Minuteman meeting? Well, in Missouri, because he said the meeting didn't last long. It was only like an hour or so. But if they're together, there's obviously a connection. And look, it could just be because these guys are both homosexuals, and they likely knew each other.
Yeah, and anti-communist.
Yeah,
so I guarantee you that
they had similar interests and similar sexual interests, and they would have been in the same circles, likely, and they could have shared the same hatred for Kennedy or any of this stuff, and so yeah, I mean, but because you had Thomas Beckham putting these guys together, you have Perry Russo putting these guys together, Robert Taylor putting these guys together, people in Clinton, Louisiana putting these guys together, and once you get so much, you got to start taking it a little more seriously.
Yeah, no, and I agree that I think that was the problem largely, was because Garrison was working with a much smaller amount of actual verifiable evidence, and because he had to take the word of certain people that later turned out, perhaps like Novell, not to be as credible as were hoped, that a lot of people have over the years taken just these pieces of credibility and tried to mash them together into, it had to be this way. Well, that's probably not the case. Just, when you look at the evidence, Garrison had some great leads, and he went after Shaw. Shaw turned out to be the wrong one, but that doesn't negate all of Garrison's ideas.
Right.
It should make people realize that Shaw isn't the focus of it. Ferry even is a hell of a lot more likely to have at least connections to anti-Castro groups. Shaw was more of a socialite. He might have been at this Minuteman meeting. Maybe he funded some of Ferry's activities. I suppose that's possible.
Quite possible, yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that. But I don't see Shaw he's not a militaristic person that would be at the head of a conspiracy.
Right.
And Ferry too. Ferry doesn't strike me. Ferry could have been used as a pawn, sort of like perhaps Oswald was, but I don't see him as the head of anything either.
Well, if only Jim Garrison had found Judith Baker and got her to testify, things might have been different.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. He would have had to waste more paper writing down that useless story.
They might have been able to convict him then,
Oh, boy.
Sorry, I just had to throw that in there,
I know, I was going to say, it's not ridiculousness of the week time yet.
This is true.
So yeah, we're in, as I said, we're in March. We have all those people, checks being done on everybody to see what's going on. That the actual leaders of the CIA, once again, Helms and a lot of the upper echelon, most likely didn't even know that any of these people had connections because they were running other operations. So now they're trying to figure out, and they're scrambling to try to find out who Garrison might be able to locate that does have an actual connection with them. So I think, so we have later memos explaining to, we actually in later memos that we're going to go over have people in the CIA explaining to their superiors the last time they had any conversation, even in passing, with Clay Shaw, because they were averse to any connection that could be exploited.
Yep.
So in April of that year, we'll go on to the third document.
Okay.
April of that year, the agency employee Raymond Roca, who you'll see come up a lot more in later document from here on.
Yeah.
He gets interviewed later too by the House Select Committee, and he was involved just in a lot of the research and a lot of the counterintelligence staff activities. So Roca makes a summary of various people who Garrison involved or sought to involve in his investigation, and then he starts to comment on it. Or did I? No, I'm good. Yeah, I wanted to make sure I didn't jump these out of order. Yeah, so Roca writes to his superiors, and he tells other people on the staff that it is suggested that the New Orleans office coordinate closely with the New Orleans office of the FBI in respect to investigations by Garrison or his staff or any person known to have had a tie to CIA. It is suggested that the New Orleans office be alert to the possibility that Garrison may tap or may have tapped home or office telephones. So it's a side I think that a lot of people never see of the CIA. They're actually afraid in this instance because all of their plots could be feasibly recorded on a bug that Garrison put that they don't know about.
Because they don't have an inside man yet.
Mm-hmm.
But they will.
I would imagine there were a couple, probably even a couple that no one's known about yet. So some of the agency genuinely feared Garrison and the power that he was legally wielding against their operations. So Roca warned his fellow agency employees that although Garrison's case now looks flimsy, our knowledge of it is far from complete and may consist almost entirely of what he is allowed to leak. In any case, the impact of any charges leveled by him against CIA would depend less on their veracity or credibility than upon their timeliness and the extent of press coverage. So I think that reveals to us that it didn't have to be the actual correct charge. It just had to be believable enough to convince the public.
Yep.
And that's, that's their own, what they do.
Yeah.
How many times, weapons of mass destruction, for instance.
Yeah.
How many times have we
right
heard?
or wrong, but they were convinced, to pursue that, and it turned out to be total bunk, but
bad intelligence happens.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah. And it's actually, you can see it in action right here, because once again, we can come back to, I can't, with all the intelligent and qualified people that were at the agency, I don't understand how one of the officers wouldn't just somebody call Garrison. We just need to sit down with him.
I know. It would have been so much easier.
But instead. Okay. The next one's a quick one. Document 4. It's just something I think that, it shows you to the extent that they were going.
Yeah.
And this is, I wanted to say before I went to this one, in 1967, by September, so a few months later, the director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, received a list of people linked to Garrison in published comments. So they were basically collecting anything in the media, putting it together and sending it to Helms so that he was always kept up to date on what was being said. So later in their investigation/manipulation of Garrison's case, February 1969, Clay Shaw's the trial was proceeding with jury selection, and results were reported to the Office of Security from an unknown staff employee that they had checked all the names against agency files that were extremely interested in the process. So they got a list of Garrison's jurors.
Oh,
and
really?
They then began to then take that jurors list apart and put it against the agency index to see if any of them had connections with them that they might be able to exploit.
Wow. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
For instance, Irvin Mason, male, born California 1920. Machine operator at Shreveport Sulphur Company, Negro. Oliver M. Schultz, male, born 1929, truck driver for New Orleans Electric Utility, married, 4 children, white. And the above info is spotty, but with all that is available from the news services and press, we will be happy to assist in any questions. All of the jurors are presumably U.S. citizens and live somewhere or near New Orleans, Louisiana area. All of the above have been run through the RID and archives index with no positive hits. I have a folder of the trace results if needed. All have also been checked against applicant file and some CI staff indexes.
Yeah, it was.
So they were very... I'm sorry, what were you saying, Ram?
Maybe we might have missed one, because I'm looking at I thought part of number 3 from April '67, where they were actually running the RID checks on people like Dean Andrews, Sergio Arcacha Smith. They say no record found for Dean Andrews, no record found for Sergio Arcacha Smith, although Garrison reportedly seeks to link him to the CIA. And I like what they say about Guy Bannister. We don't have to worry about him. Deceased.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I missed that. Yeah, I missed that little piece. Yeah, when they were talking about the conversation that he had with McConnell, and they started talking about the different people. And no one in this office knew David W. Ferrier, had any dealings with him officially or otherwise.
Yeah.
This seems true of all the persons except paragraph 3 of the memorandum from 1920.
Yeah, and they were running traces on Leslie Bradley, which I'm guessing was Eugene Hale Brading. Carlos Bernier, traces being run. See reference B. They were tracing Vernon Bundy. You know, the supposed junkie who saw Clay Shaw and Ferry and Clinton. Mm-hmm. Just they were checking him for links to the CIA. It's crazy.
Yeah, and they were doing it to everybody. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't go over the whole list, but Edward S. Butler, Julio Buznito, Ferry, deceased, no identifiable RI traces. What the crazy thing about Bannister, they just say deceased.
Yeah,
he wasn't an informant. They knew.
Oh yeah,
but that wasn't going to be brought up, or maybe the person who was putting the list together wasn't informed or didn't have access to the file. See, that's the crazy thing about the agency, is that at times the left hand didn't know what the right was doing.
Right.
And there were just so many things going on that half the people they wanted to find stuff, they never actually told the things they were looking for where they could be found.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Bannister was balls deep in something down there, and they had to know what he was up to. The informants.
Oh, definitely through Smith. Yeah.
Yeah. If he wasn't, if he wasn't working for or reporting to the agency, then somebody else was. What he was doing down there, for sure. Because he had his fingers in all kinds of shit going on down there in New Orleans with the exiles and these extreme right wing groups and propaganda and infiltration and
And that all makes sense. Like, I think that's the part that once again, kind of like people on each side want to only take the parts they like. But the more reasonable is that it's a mixture of both. Is that, Bannister was likely associated in those things, Ferry too, maybe even Shaw to a certain extent, and we know that Ferry and Bannister knew each other. We know that Martin and Ferry, you can connect them. It's not, Garrison did not have an unreasonable idea. Just because it didn't play out the way that he thought it was going to doesn't negate the fact that, these people were all involved. The chances are in illegal activities. We got the raid on the Huma station in 61 or 62 that we know Ferry's been linked to, Bannister's been linked to for storing the munitions.
Yeah.
We know that other people that are familiar in the case, like Gerald Patrick Hemming and others, have been claimed to have been there. Novell at one point tried to claim he was there. So, there's definitely illegal activities going on, and it all was on Garrison's radar, and he just had so many things going on and had so many forces against him, he wasn't able to get it done. But that doesn't make, the credible leads not credible anymore.
Yeah, and speaking of possible infiltrators, since you brought him up, I'm sure we weren't going to talk about him otherwise, but Jerry Hemming, worked for a little while as an investigator for Garrison. He offered his services, and was led down some various roads that didn't quite pan out too well. But he's another one, that Garrison, bought into, and just like some of these other guys we're going to be talking about.
Well, I think too. Yeah, I think he had kind of like Novell with Hemming. They had just enough credibility to believe, what exactly they were saying, so it was able to be convincing. Like with Hemming was connected to exile groups. He was illegally training exiles in the United States at camps that the agency at some occasions funded. We can produce documents to show that these guys were involved in the anti-Castro activities. It's just that to Kennedy is where it starts to, fall apart. But it was enough, and it made sense, since that they could actually account that they knew these people, that there are connections between these people then, and then maybe that's a group, and,
Yeah, it could lead them somewhere else, that they didn't want to go.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, no, well, think about it. Think if let's say 1967, I mean, it could have easily, if Garrison would have been able to get his hands on some of the actual files, it could have easily gone from the Kennedy case to, instead they were running, illegal domestic programs that the CIA was funding foreign nationals.
Yep.
To run illegal programs here to go and kill world leaders in other countries.
Yeah, and that's a huge, huge problem if it gets out back then,
That's about Kennedy size, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, they definitely could not have that. They're trying to protect their interests, they're not just going to let it go and see what happens. Of course they're going to try to disrupt things, but like you said, it'd been a lot easier to just sit them down and say, look, this is what we're doing, stay away.
I know. I don't understand. It'll always baffle me why they didn't.
I know.
So I mean, and yeah, there were, as you said, just a ton of people. Novell, Quiroga, Russo, David Lewis, another highly uncredible witness. Emilio Santana, Shaw, Edward Stewart Suggs. Basically, yeah, just a lot of they were scraping anything they could to try to protect themselves. Trying to run down every lead they possibly could, which surprises me because a lot of time I wish that they would have used this sort of diligence in their actual investigation.
Right.
If it didn't just have directly to protecting themselves, I wish they would have used that sort of diligence to actually look for some things.
Well, later on, of course, with the HSCA, when they were trying to investigate into the CIA, they called a guy we're going to be talking about here in a minute, George Joanides, back out of retirement to kind of, run point on the CIA access from, to the HSCA, because as we're going to find out, he was involved in some very suspicious activity in New Orleans, and it's a huge red flag for me for them to pull this guy out of retirement and put him in charge of the CIA documents that the HSCA could get their hands on.
Yeah, no, it is definitely a curious choice. He basically got a lot, he had been discussed briefly by some people. And when Joanides came out, I think, some of the credit for putting the spotlight on him should go to Jefferson Morley. He basically has talked a lot about him, written on the subject.
Yeah.
And Joanides, I think, he was operating in multiple places. We can, for sure, based on, I know that there's other evidence out there too, but based on the file that I found, I think that we can definitely be able to say from this point forward, he was a former employee who was working with student groups, likely Kebza exile Cuban student groups, and he was working for the CIA in '63, despite what officials have said. So, do you want to go to him, or do you want to do Novell first? Rob?
Oh, that's me. Had a mute on. My fault.
Okay.
We can go to Joanides since we're talking about him, and
okay.
You found that very good fitness report done on George Ioannidis in the time period of January 1st, 1963 to July 31st, 1963. So we're talking about a 7-month stretch here, performance evaluation. And why don't we get into a little bit of his specific duties?
Okay. Well, Ioannidis was an ops officer. People who have a look at the later on, in his specific duties was deputy chief of branch, handling in absence of chief all aspects of political action and psychological warfare activity, and supervising case officers and clerical personnel. So this would indicate that he was a high-ranking officer. In the absence of the chief of the station, he was in charge. And the station he happened to be at was JM Wave.
Yeah.
Which is a notorious station in Miami known for running Cuban exile programs.
Yep. Yep, that's a red flag.
Now, another specific duty is he's case officer for student project involving political action, propaganda, intelligence collection, and a hemisphere-wide apparatus, which would also include New Orleans and other places.
Yeah.
Anything across the hemisphere.
Yeah. And to really tear that apart, student project, meaning people around the same age as Lee Oswald, we're talking about probably college students, involving political actions, propaganda, intelligence collection. Okay, that sounds just like what Lee Oswald was doing in New Orleans. And I'm not saying Ioannidis is running him, because I'm sure there'd be a few buffers in between there and there. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, I mean, it's right there is proof that the CIA was running these kind of operations.
Yeah, and if not with Oswald, then someone like Bringay would be perfect.
Right.
Bringay would be another kind of person that would have worked with Ioannidis. And they talk about later in the document when they're talking about a 63 fitness report, they say that under the subject's references made to January 1963, the period covered by this subject has done an excellent job in the handling of a significant student exile group. So, like the DRE.
Yep.
Which hereto has successfully resisted any important degree of control. Under subject's direction, an exiled teachers group reached a high level of effectiveness in the propaganda field and was turned over to another case officer. Subject has effectively terminated unproductive operations in the prop field, one magazine and a newsletter, and is building up station radio capability directed at the main target. Cuba is what I would assume the main target is.
Right. And this is not a unique set of circumstances, to the CIA. I mean, the FBI were doing this kind of stuff with like COINTELPRO, and even both guys I talked to for the Minutemen said that they were doing a lot of the same things, just to out communists. Running these false kind of student political things and propaganda to get people to sign up. Then they'd have their name on a list, and they could out these people as communists. Know who could be trusted, who's not. And it would just be fascinating to have Guy Bannister's files, but yeah.
Well,
and happen.
But we definitely know that he did work with Sergio Acacia Smith. So once again, it's another link to Cuban exile groups. Those are very close as far as what they were doing. Hal Bannister could have known Ioannidis, or Bannister could have known someone who was a buffer for Ioannidis, because they were all basically doing the same thing. They were doing psychological warfare and propaganda.
Exactly.
And like you were saying, Bannister was doing lists he was actually doing background checks on lists to see who was good to have in Smith's organization, and who was a communist, that they could use that information against them later too. So yeah, a lot of similar activity going on by all these different groups.
Yeah, and he would have been in the position to know stuff like this, being former SAIC of Chicago, former assistant police chief or deputy police chief in New Orleans. I mean, you're not going to be a deputy police chief and not know what's going on in your city, and you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, he should have had, yeah, all these guys would have had some sort of line on it. And I think the reason why a lot of people find Joanides to be so nefarious is because he had a direct hand in, for sure, at the very least, hemisphere-wide operations. But we can definitely say that at Jam Wave, operating from Miami with student groups, and that's where, there were DRE there were CRC there. All the exile groups went to Miami first before they went anywhere else. And they spread out to other areas. So he had his finger on the pulse of everything, and then he retires, and for some reason, they neglect to tell everyone that was working with the HSCA that he was a former case officer for one of the very groups that he was supposed to be giving them evidence on.
Yeah, and that's a big red flag, too, people.
Maybe a conflict of interest, you might say.
Yeah, a gigantic one.
Well, yeah. I mean, and people don't realize that sort of stuff was going on. He was represented to just be another person from the Office of Legal Counsel.
Yeah, just another schleppy CIA,
official. Yeah, just
pusher paper.
Some guy there
paper
to push.
pusher.
Yeah, just there to push papers. He had no, and that was affirmed to everyone, I'm sure, at some point legally, that these were just people with no direct interest. But Joanides had a direct interest. That was his work. They were basically investigating the things he did.
Yeah.
So he had an interest in making sure that they never found any of the illegal things that he might have done.
Yeah, and he would have been in the perfect position to know exactly what should go and what should stay hidden.
Mm-hmm. And, we have, I can't remember what show it was, but one of your prior shows that we did, one of my favorite documents that I found was, it's just a little side document, but it just talks about, it's S.D. Breckenridge, who was the Inspector General at the time of the CIA, I believe. And he wrote to the HSCA, the HSCA said that they've read all of our files. Let me just be the first to tell you, no, you haven't. You haven't even read 70% of all of our files on this.
Definitely believable.
So, yeah, yeah, so, he also, I think what Joanides represents is he's another active manipulation by the agency. He is actively subverting the HSCA to make sure that things come out the way they need to for the agency.
Yep, make sure they're coming out smelling like a rose.
No discernible connections anyway.
Right. So, Gordon Novell?
Oh, boy. Mr. Novell, yeah. A lot of people try to say that Gordon Novell is a legitimate connection in the Garrison case and that he's worth exploring and that some of what he said is true. And I'm just going to have to say that I disagree on all of those based on the evidence.
Yeah, and if you... I might put some of them up on the page, but he, in his later years, gave some pretty wild interviews.
Oh, okay. I haven't heard any of those. I'll have to check those out after.
Man. Oh, yeah. He looks...
he said some crazy stuff in this stuff. I can only imagine and give him a couple more years to come up with some stuff.
Oh, yeah. This is when he was probably in his 60s. And he's recounting, everything that he did in his life. And that's pretty wild stuff.
Yeah, for any of the listeners that don't know who he is, Gordon Novell was a fixture of disinformation within the Garrison case. He was also a repeated thorn in the side of the agency. He claimed associations and employment with the agency. However, the evidence reveals his claims are not accurate. Novell did have multiple contacts with a few Central Intelligence Agency representatives, but each contact was used by Novell. It never really came to anything, but the contacts themselves, just that he had made contact so many times, were used by Novell to sell an improbable idea and later claim connections to the agency.
Right. And if he was actually used by, some of these people, it was never official, and it was likely, under the table type stuff, because he was a dirty kind of dude. He was very skilled at what's the word I'm looking for? Listening devices,
Oh, okay, yeah,
bugs,
wiretaps and all that.
Yeah, he was very, very skilled at all this kind of stuff. So if he ever was used, it was probably never in an official capacity, and likely wouldn't have showed up on anybody's radar or anything like that. He probably wouldn't be mentioned by name in documents or anything of that nature.
And,
But
yeah, and his skills would have probably, like you said, been in the technological field that he knew something about. They
exactly.
wouldn't have. He wasn't an assassin. He wasn't there to see Oswald do anything.
No, he wasn't a super spy or anything like
No.
that. He would have been used for his technical skills, more than likely, if he was used at all. And,
Yeah.
But like you said, we have no proof that he was ever used, except what he says. So.
We do have some funny stories, though.
Yes.
So one occasion long after Garrison's trial, just as an illustrative about Novell, was his attempt to have the agency let him conduct arms sales on a modified ship capable of military combat. He basically wanted to set up like a cruise liner that was military capable, that he would display armaments and sell them across the world, I guess, for his and the agency's benefit, and then let the agency find out who all these arms dealers were that would come on his boat, I guess.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So his roving arms deal thing doesn't really get accepted.
Yeah, I can't see why not. But
Ultimately, the agency officer dealing with Novell, an interesting fellow on his own, J. Walton Moore, who was the former leader of the Dallas field office in 1963 of the agency, states, "We listened to him, his expressions of anger and frustration over having his proposal thwarted by some unseen and nameless bureaucrats of questionable competence, and we remained silent as he delivered his threat. When he had finished, we told him frankly that he had been wasting our time and his frequent calls and unsolicited contributions, and we asked him not to call us again."
yeah, he sounds like a nut job, basically.
Yeah. By 79, by 75, definitely. If he hadn't been in 67, by 75, he was having some problems.
Yeah. These interviews, man, he looks like he just stepped out of like a 1970s British spy thriller movie. He's got the dark black suit, turtleneck, the dark, dyed black goatee. He's, oh my God, it's crazy. I'm about to find him and put him up.
He's Dr. Evil.
Basically, yeah.
Novell is trying to be Dr. Evil a couple of times here.
Stroking his kitty cat.
So they basically find Novell ridiculous, and there's several instances that he has attempted to furnish information or sell proposals, they have that in quotes, to the CIA. The file material suggests that Novell fancies himself an intelligence officer and is prone to making exaggerated claims and appears somewhat unbalanced.
Yeah, well, he sounds like an idea man. He's got a lot of ideas. Yeah. Hey, I got a great idea. Let me bug you again.
Yeah, well, here's another one. For example, in July 1974, a source of the Los Angeles office was approached by Novell, who was seeking a company to do filming for an expose-type documentary movie on the topic of the CIA as instigator of the Watergate break-in. He claimed to be getting substantive assistance and cooperation from James Garrison.
I'm sure that went over well.
Exactly.
Oh my.
So Novell is bringing heat to Garrison even in 74, like years after the trial's over. Novell is still causing problems for Garrison.
Yeah. Well, Garrison might have been bitter enough to use him to do that. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean it's and it's just that's the pattern that Novell often displays. The boat story.
Yeah,
he's just constantly trying to get a deal done, try to make some money on it, to try to manipulate it so that he can get some sort of advantage with the agency.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like his MO.
So the agency, which I haven't seen, I mean, I'm sure they exist for other people, but I haven't seen a lot of these. The agency actually creates a certificate and certifies I, Robert S. Waddles, the Director of Personnel for the Central Intelligence Agency, and in this capacity have custody of the personal records of the Central Intelligence Agency. These personnel records are maintained in the state of Virginia. I have directed that a diligent search of the Central Intelligence Agency personnel records be made to ascertain if Gordon Dwayne Novell has ever been employed or considered for employment by the agency. The diligent search has been completed and indicates that Gordon Dwayne Novell, at his request on 22 December 1967, was interviewed as an applicant for employment by a member of the Office of Personnel, Central Intelligence Agency. The search also indicates, based on the information supplied at such an interview, the interview did not recommend employment, and his application for employment was not further processed by the Central Intelligence Agency. The personal records of the Central Intelligence Agency contain no record of employment of Gordon Dwayne Novell.
Yeah, so what he was doing in New Orleans could have been part of his job application, you know. So look what I can do. Here's what I can do for you, you know.
Yeah, he might have been trying to impress them by screwing with Garrison's case.
Yep.
And yeah, we know that he offered, you know, random. He sent a FedEx to Richard Helms, who was director of the agency at the time, you know, trying to talk about what he was doing with Garrison, and that Garrison was saying that he worked for them, so would he pay his legal bills for him? That really shows you how far they went, because they didn't want this guy. They're like, we don't know who he is. We'll swear it in court. We have officers who will swear it in court. It's notarized.
Yeah, I mean, he was, you know, trying to make a name for himself, and in the process, you know, be a kind of thorn in everybody's side, and really looking out for one person, and that's himself.
It was always for Novell's advantage that he was, and I think that this our last document, I think, goes into that, where it shows you, based on various witnesses and people who knew Novell, when they're talking about him, because they did an internal investigation of him, I'm sure, before they decided to do the certificate. And the agency's internal investigation of Novell stated that his motives remain obscure, because I'm sure they wanted to use him if they could find something useful for him to do. But because he was so out there, and because he wasn't paying attention to any credibility for what he was claiming, they just realized he was useless as far as their activities. But they were still trying to figure out anything they could of use for him. Like, his motives remain, they say his motives remain obscure. It is a clear possibility that he remained an ally of Garrison after their seeming antagonism developed. If so, his efforts to link himself publicly with the CIA could be part of Garrison's attack upon the agency. This theory would also explain Novell's relationship to Garrison crony Willard Robertson. Another possibility is the feud is genuine. Novell has made very strong accusations against Garrison in major radio broadcasts. These include charges of occasional homosexuality and possible direct involvement in the alleged murder of David Ferry. How crazy is that? I had never heard those until I came across this document.
Yeah, me either. That's definitely interesting.
And once again, just like with Garrison and Shaw, those could hurt Garrison even though they weren't true.
Right.
You know, he was slandering Garrison in the media, and officials thought that might be useful, I suppose, but they couldn't trust him because he just kept changing his story so many times and just saying anything.
Yeah, why the hell would Garrison kill his star witness?
Exactly. That makes no sense whatsoever. So I think he was just throwing anything against the wall to see what stuck.
Oh, man. And, of course, that wasn't the first time they tried to get Jim Garrison hemmed up on some homosexual type stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anything they could to discredit him.
Unbelievable.
So the agency had an informant named Miss Merrily, and she stated that she formed a clear impression that Novell's dislike of Garrison is genuine. Agency employee Donovan Pratt wondered if the dislike was genuine, was Novell's true motivation or if his true motivation was to create. He had a company, International Dynamics Corporation, an aura of prestige as a result of supposed ties to the federal government. Novell had listed the U.S. government as one of his clients.
That's been a little vague.
Yeah. And he repeatedly claimed to have penetrated Garrison's entourage, which to an extent was true. He had gotten in, unfortunately, he came across Garrison's radar, and once Garrison had questioned him, he tried to make the most of it and was trying to play both sides against each other, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, he wasn't the only one that got in there and tried to wreak havoc. Some other people we didn't touch on too much. Maybe we can at a future date. People like Walter Sheridan and
Oh yeah, yeah.
Bill
Novell actually
Boxley
worked
and
yeah. Novell worked directly with Sheridan, and one of the documents that I've read, I think we talked about it, was the CIA was keeping track because it was a piece that was supposed to bury Garrison, was the quote.
yeah, and of course, Sheridan was working for Bobby, and the Justice Department, and they had their own things that they didn't want to get out as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, and they directly interfered. You had the Justice Department flying down Dr. Boswell to come in and do damage control on Dr. Fink's statements that were going on during the Garrison trial.
Yeah. I mean, people always say, well, RFK wasn't really, didn't believe in what Garrison was doing and believe the official story or this and that, but he sent Sheridan down there to definitely shake some things up, because there was some stuff going on, and I've talked about it on an earlier episode, but there was some stuff going on in the Justice Department with the Oswald file and Otto Atepka and Sheridan and all these guys. They were trying to definitely cover up their Cuban exile involvement and their things like Alpha 66 and
yeah, that's the thing. The Kennedys, people need to understand, were human, and they did screw up a bunch of times, and they did go along with the agency on things like the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
They made some mistakes, and they made some enemies. And unfortunately, based on what Bobby wanted to keep hidden and what the Justice Department wanted to keep hidden, they obstructed Garrison's case, and they did it intentionally. So you can't hold Bobby as being totally innocent. He was part of the obstruction because he let it go. He knew what Sheridan was doing, or somebody knew. You can't say that he was totally ignorant of what everyone under him is doing.
Yeah, and it's it's likely Bobby knew a lot of what was going on down there, because his office was he had an office at the CIA building, and he would have been privy to a lot of this operations, likely, or at least heard some buzz about them, But...
Well, yeah, and him and John, when President Kennedy was in office, he and President Kennedy directly interceded into some of the CIA operations. Like, they ran before, the Bay of Pigs and all the failures that started to happen. They had, trying to remember what it was, the special group, and Bobby was in charge, and it was various, other people like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and they would all get together and meet about various things like Cuba. So, he was point on that, and President Kennedy was the ultimate authority. So
yeah, and they were getting, CIA briefs every day.
Mm-hmm. So, they weren't, they didn't know everything, of course, because nobody knew everything at the agency, even its own leaders.
Right.
But they did know a large portion, and they couldn't have been ignorant of all of it. They played integral parts in the original assassinations and overthrow attempts on Cuba.
Yeah. Well, man, interesting stuff for sure. I hope, Carmine, that next year we get at least some more documents out of there that we can help us, to piece some of this stuff together, because what we have so far, you can really, really find some interesting stuff in there. But you got to know where to dig, and you got to get lucky. And, it's a lot of people don't do the hard work anymore of going to the archives and getting a box and just digging and digging and digging for hours.
Oh, yeah. And I understand. Yeah, even online it can be, it's a daunting task because there's so many millions of files.
I know. And
if you don't know where to look, you're going to be looking, maybe, unfortunately, in the wrong place for a long time until you find something.
Yep. And I don't know about you, but trying to look through the archives online is a daunting task, man. Like, you need to know.
You know me.
Yeah.
It's my obsession.
I know.
That's why I'm obsessive, so I've just grown used to it.
I don't even try. I live literally, I probably an hour and a half, 2 hours from the archives.
Oh yeah, you live by the National Archives.
Yeah, the one in College Park, where all this stuff is there in Maryland, and it's just so hard to take some time and take some time off and go up there and really try to get into stuff. I think I'd probably go there and waste so much time trying to find something, get like one document and leave or something. But
Exactly. Well, usually, yeah. If it's a very special one that you can't get online, I'd say that that's definitely where I went to the National Archives once, and you can find some good stuff or see some, stuff that you couldn't online. But I really respect places like the Mary Farrell Foundation who have put all that online for us, though, to make it a lot easier. Because there's people around the world that can do research online where, they're nowhere near any place that carries any of these files.
oh, no doubt. I mean, that's a really valuable resource. That and places like History Matters and
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. History Matters is another good one. JFK Land. So there's a lot of, what is it? I was going to say the Weisberg Archives, another good one.
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and there's stuff, we're getting our hands on new stuff that really wasn't out there before. Like I saw today, Bart Camp, the guy that runs prayerman.com, he just recently posted some documents he obtained from Malcolm Blunt, and it's probably about, he said it was about 20 pages or so that has I was basically Oswald's last 48 hours chronicled in timeline form, and got people at the Texas School Book Depository and information on them and Marina and Ruth Payne, and it's really interesting. So if you want to check it out, people, head over to prayerman.com. There's a button on the website over at tlgpodcast.com where you can head over there and check it out. I mean, he's adding a lot of good stuff. Malcolm Blunt's another one of these researchers that spent a lot of time at the archives and has stuff in his possession that nobody's ever seen before. Because he's old school. He's not like online. It's
It goes
a lot of
to the
personal
files.
collection. Yeah.
Yep. Like Weisberg.
Yeah, but eventually, these guys get older and realize, look, somebody needs to do something with all this stuff, and I'm just sitting on it, and here, take it all,
Yeah.
So hopefully, eventually, we'll get some new stuff that way, or like I said, when next year, hopefully, we get some results from the 2017 release, and I don't know if Jefferson Morley's lawsuit's still going on about the Joe and Edie's files.
Yep.
Maybe we'll get
But
something
who
from
knows?
that.
They get dragged out. Legal suits get dragged out as long as they possibly can, I'm sure.
Yeah, and just financially draining, and
That's what they're hoping. They're hoping you'll go away. That's what officials usually always try to do, is just wait out anybody.
yeah, that's a good plan because they got deep pockets. They can last anybody out. So,
Mm-hmm.
but
Do you mind if I do a quick plug?
no, plug away, my friend.
If listeners please get a chance, go by tpac.com, tpaak.com, or neamg.com. There you'll also find an archive of the Best of the Lone Gunman podcast and the Best of the Ocelli Effect. We also have primary evidence collections where you can go through some of these documents and other things that we've posted for you to review. If you get an opportunity to, please tune in, of course, to every episode of the Lone Gunman podcast and the Ocelli Effect. Both we are happy to associate Neapolis Media Group with them, and I think you guys both, you have your own separate type of show, but you do, great contributions from both sides. So.
Well, thank you, sir. And I would urge everybody out there to get a copy of your excellent book as well. It's a great resource to have, and for anybody of any any level of the assassination research, not only of JFK, but RFK and MLK too, it is definitely a keeper. And you can
Thank you.
And you can get it on neamg.com. There's links to Amazon there, and on my website as well. There's a page dedicated to it too, where you can get your Amazon link and get yourself a copy of Two Princes and a King. Well, Carmine, man, I appreciate it. It's always fun when you come on, and I guess we'll have to do it again real soon.
Of course. It's a pleasure, man. I appreciate coming back. Yeah, exactly. It's and some people, like I've explained once on Chuck Show, it's our gallows humor. You have to be able to laugh about some of this stuff. It is a harsh subject, and it is very daunting to do some of this, so a laugh helps now and then.
Yeah, I mean, we got to have fun with some of this stuff. It'd be boring.
Yeah, and how crazy some of it gets. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we just monotone Ben Stein it all.
So please tell me about the next document, Carmine. Yeah, who wants to hear that?
Yeah, NPR.
Oh, shit. All right. Well, we'll do it again real soon, I promise. People, everybody, for more, head over to tlgpodcast.com. If you want to check out the documents for this show, I'm going to post them up there, the links, and you can see them for yourself with your own 2 eyes. Do it. Until next time, people, the sumbitch is in the can, beaming up the satellite down directly to your ears, people. This is your boy. Peace.